to a back burner, and people don't know about these things. Well, there's a good other reason why people don't know about Hakhel, because it doesn't apply anymore in actual practice in terms of what was done in the past. So let's first define the word Hakhel. Hakhel is a biblical word. It's in the book of Deuteronomy, and it means gather. In Hebrew, there are several words for a gathering. There's a word called tzibur. Tzibur means a community, a congregation. There's kahal, which is the same as the root of Hakhel. So here the Torah commands us to do Hakhel. So what exactly is this about? So first of all, we know there are 613 commandments in the Torah. And if we follow the order in which they're written in the Torah, the last two commandments are Hakhel and writing a Torah scroll. Now we can understand that writing a Torah scroll, why it's so fundamental, because usually when you end with something, it's because of the centrality of that subject. There's an expression in the Talmud, everything follows the end. The last statement of an important document really encapsulates everything that came before. So we can understand why writing a Torah scroll is the last commandment, because it represents creating the document that is the basis of all of Judaism. Without the Torah scroll, we don't have any of the commandments. Of course, we have the oral law, but the oral law explains the written law. So everything starts with the Torah scroll. But why is Hakhel the penultimate commandment? This number 612. So in order to understand that, let's first go through the biblical source. This is taken from the book of Devarim, which is Deuteronomy. And it says as follows: at the end of 7 years, during the festival of the Sabbatical year, during the festival of Sukkot, when all of Israel comes to see the face of God your God, in the place that he shall choose, you shall read this Torah to all of Israel in their ears. And then it goes on: gather the nation, the men, the women, and the children, and the converts that are in your gates, so that they will listen and they will learn and fear God your God, and they will make sure to keep all of the words of this Torah. So let's explain it in simple terms. The Jewish system of reckoning years goes by sevens. Every 7 years is a sabbatical year. When did that start? When the Jews came to Israel in the conquest. It took them 7 years to conquer the land and another 7 years to settle it, more or less. And then they started counting the years of a sabbatical system. So every 7 years after that, in other words, from year 15, that was year number 1 of the cycle, and year number 7 was a sabbatical year. What happens in a sabbatical year in Israel? In Israel, a sabbatical year is a radical change of everything. Number 1, you're not allowed to do any planting of any crops that whole year, a full year. Number 2, you're not allowed to show any ownership of what has grown during that year. Anyone could come into your field, into your orchard, into your garden, and pluck the fruits, the vegetables. It belongs to everyone. You cannot exercise any ownership over it.
Is that today too?
The question was, is that today too? And the answer is yes. Rabbinically, the biblical requirement ceased when the 10 tribes were driven out of the land. Because the condition for this law to apply is that you have to have all of the Jewish tribes living on the land. And since 10 tribes were driven out, the law no longer was in effect biblically. But the rabbis said, we don't want people to forget about this important institution, so they reinstituted the sabbatical year. So the question is, how do you eat? What are you going to eat? You know, the Torah asked that question. In the Torah it says, after it tells you to keep the sabbatical year, and if you shall say, what are we going to eat? I will give you a blessing in the 6th year that will be enough for the 6th year, the 7th year, and the 8th year. That was the Torah's promise that would be the case. That was when it was a biblical commandment. Now that it's rabbinical, there are certain leniencies. I'm not going to go into all the details. There are 2 systems in Israel right now. There's one system where the more lenient approach is to sell the land to a non-Jew for the duration of that year. Just like we sell our chametz before Passover, so that we're not an owner of chametz, of leavened bread and bread products, so on and so forth. The same way they would sell the land. And that's a controversial mechanism. The more strict rely on handouts from people who contribute to provide them with food for the whole year. At any rate, this is not a class about the sabbatical year, but to understand the Hakhel, it's linked to the sabbatical year.
I'm not quite clear on why it ceased to be a biblical requirement. The destruction of the temple, but it was still...
No, even before the destruction of the first temple, it ceased to be biblical, according to Maimonides and others. Why? Because the way the Torah phrases this commandment, it's in terms of when all of the people, enter the land. So it has to be at least the majority of the people. Not just numbers of people, but also the tribes, the majority of the tribes living there. That's what created the institution of the sabbatical year. But that's a separate topic. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a background of what the sabbatical year is. So what does the Torah tell us? During that year, what did people do during that year? In those days, you didn't have all sorts of professions that we have today. Most people worked on agriculture. So if you're not working in agriculture for a full year, what are you doing? So you're watching reruns, of course. What else could you be doing? You would study Torah. Most people couldn't study Torah all day long because they had to go to work early in the morning and come back home late. So they studied a little in the morning and a little in the evening. But when you had a full year, when you didn't have to do any work, you were able to devote yourself to the study of Torah. To add to that is that when the year comes to an end, and the Jewish calendar year starts with Rosh Hashanah, and all the Jews would come for the pilgrimage to be in Jerusalem during the holiday of Sukkot, which comes right after Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So God tells us in the Torah, take advantage of that holiday and gather all the Jews to the Beis Hamikdash, to the Holy Temple, and have the Torah read to them, to exhort them, to inspire them, to excite them, to get them ready for the next 7 years, when they're not going to be able to have a year free of all their commitments to work. So this is the general idea, that at the end of the sabbatical year, to cap it off, everyone would come together in Jerusalem and the Torah would be read. Now let's go into the rationale why this mitzvah is considered to be such an important mitzvah. It's the very last, the second to the last mitzvah in the Torah. Again, the last mitzvah is to write a Torah scroll. That we can understand why that's the seal of the Torah. But why is the commandment to read the Torah during the holiday of Sukkot in the post-sabbatical year, why is that such a fundamental mitzvah that it is something that the Torah wanted to remain with, so it puts it at the very end? And the answer to it is that the whole ceremony that happened then was a reenactment of what happened at Mount Sinai. When was the first time all of the Jewish people were gathered together, men, women, children? The first time that happened was at Mount Sinai. And tragically, Mount Sinai, what happened there, although it was the most important event in all of human history and will never be repeated, has been lost to so many people and so many Jews. And it was important that Jewish people come together at certain times and try to reenact what happened at Mount Sinai. So they didn't have any recordings of what happened at Mount Sinai. So the second best thing would be that the king, the leader of the Jewish people, would read selections of the Torah in the presence of the entire Jewish nation, men, women, and children. And this would take place in the Beit HaMikdash, in the Holy Temple. And there's some discussion about how could they fit so many people. The Temple Mount is a pretty nice size, but it's still to accommodate millions of people. How is that possible? Well, that's the question that we'll leave unanswered. Some people suggest that there was an overflow outside of the temple, and some say it was purely miraculous. But whatever it is, everyone was there, including little babies. Normally, little babies didn't have to come to the pilgrimage. A child that was old enough to understand, but here it was even little babies, according to many opinions. So that's why it's such an important mitzvah, because there's no more important experience than the experience of Sinai. And we always have to be mindful of it. I mentioned this many times, that we get very upset when people deny our history, when people deny the Holocaust, for example. If only they were right, that there was no Holocaust, we'd be very happy. But it pales in comparison to denying the experience at Mount Sinai. Because without Mount Sinai, without the God giving us the Torah at Mount Sinai, there is no Jewish people. There's no such thing. There's no Jewish religion. If I would be convinced that there was no revelation at Mount Sinai, I wouldn't want to be Jewish for 1 second. Why be Jewish? It's crazy to be Jewish. You're only subjected to hatred, to persecution, to oppression. Why would Jews go through their history for thousands of years and resist every attempt at trying to convert them, if not for the fact that they believed this with all their heart and all their soul, that God revealed himself to us and gave us the Torah? But it's important that we keep on inspiring ourselves and re-inspiring ourselves, so that once in 7 years, at an appropriate time, we reenacted what happened at Mount Sinai. That's why the Torah ends with this mitzvah. It's the penultimate mitzvah, to tell us that this is the seal of Judaism. What is a seal? When you put a seal on an envelope, what is the idea behind it? The seal is there to protect the content of the envelope, what's inside the envelope. You want to have a seal to it. The seal of Judaism is Hakhel, is Jews gathering together to reenact and remember the revelation at Mount Sinai. The simple explanation why it's at the end of the Torah is that Moses was the king. Moses had every power that a king has. Even though he wasn't called king, except in one verse, he is actually referred to as king. At the end of Deuteronomy, it says, Vayehi Bishurun Melech. And there was, Yeshurun is Israel, there was a king. And it refers, according to one interpretation, to Moses. Moses was a king, although we primarily look at him as a teacher, as a prophet, but he was also a leader, and he had the power of life and death in his hands. His successor, Joshua, was also a king, even though he was primarily not a monarch. That's not how he's described, but he was, in effect, a king. So Moses was the first king to read the Torah to the Jewish people, and now he's handing it over to Joshua. That's why at the end of the Torah, where Moses is giving over the reins of power, of leadership to Joshua, the Torah tells us about this commandment, which applies to a king. A king is supposed to read the Torah during the Hakhel gathering.
Rabbi?
Yes?
If one were to be directed by a king and by a prophet, who does one follow?
Oh, good question. If you have a king tells you one thing and the prophet tells you something else, who do you follow?
Your mother.
The answer, your mother. Okay, that's a good answer. The king himself is bound by what the prophet says. The Jewish system of monarchy is a constitutional monarchy. The king cannot override any law. And if he does, he is guilty of a crime just like any other person would be. So if a prophet who's known as a prophet tells him something, he has to listen. Now, he could argue with the prophet, but it depends on what the prophet is saying. What is he basing it on? It's not just a prophet. If the rabbi says one thing and the king doesn't agree, the rabbi has the power to tell the king what to do. The rabbi meaning the expert of Jewish law. So if the king says, I don't want to observe this commandment the way that you're telling me, the rabbi might get his head chopped off in some cases in history, which is what happened. Certain rabbis had to run away, flee Israel because the king was angry at them. But legally, the king was bound by the laws of the Torah and by the laws and rabbinical laws. Another aspect of Hakhel, Judaism, the way we live our Judaism is reenacting things of the past and paving the way for the future. When will we have again all of the Jewish people gathered together, literally gathered together in one place? Now we could do it through Zoom, but that's not exactly being gathered together in one place. That will be in the days of Mashiach, when we'll have again the king, Mashiach will be the king, reading the Torah during the holiday of Sukkot in the presence of every man, woman, and child. So when we do Hakhel now, when we gather now, we are reenacting the past and paving the way for the future. That's why it's such a fundamental mitzvah. Now, we don't really have the means to do the mitzvah literally. We don't have a king, and we don't have the Beit HaMikdash, we don't have the Holy Temple. So we can't fulfill this mitzvah the way the Torah describes it. But nevertheless, the Rebbe very strongly urged that we should take the spirit of the mitzvah. What's the spirit? The spirit is two things. Number one, Jews gathering together. Jews with different views, with different attitudes, with different levels of observance and commitment. And in spite of their differences, even if every Jew followed the Torah precisely, we would still have as many opinions as we have Jews. It has nothing to do with your level of observance. It has to do with the fact that we are people who use their heads and we think, and each person has his own or her own ideas. The Talmud says, just like there are no two people who look alike, there are no two people who think alike. And that's not considered a negative as long as it doesn't get in the way of our relations with one another. So whenever Jews gather together, that is, it's in and of itself a reenactment of Hakhel. But the second part is when the goal is to strengthen our commitment to Torah. That was the whole goal of Hakhel. It wasn't just getting together for unity. It was unity with a cause, with an objective, with a purpose of showing reverence for God and translating that into better observance. So the Rebbe would emphasize that nowadays, even though we don't have the ability to fulfill the mitzvah literally, every detail with a king reading the Torah in the presence of all the Jews in the Holy Temple, we're missing three things. Number one, we're missing the king, we're missing the Holy Temple, and we're missing the ability to gather all the Jews together. We don't have that ability. But nevertheless, we can still do it, and the Rebbe emphasized that during this year, the whole year is colored by that one event during the holiday of Sukkot. So the whole year is a year that is very much receptive to the idea of unity and of strengthening our faith and strengthening our commitments. Now, let's go into the specifics of this mitzvah. Who would read the Torah? So I already answered, the king. But Jews didn't always have kings. They had the temple, the Second Temple era. Jews did not have kings, at least not in the beginning. Later on, when the Hasmoneans defeated the Greeks, and the children and the grandchildren of the original Maccabees decided that they liked the idea of being leaders, and they arrogated to themselves the role of king. Thought it was mine. And that was a controversial thing, that they were not supposed to be kings, because they were Kohanim, they were priests. And Jewish law does not allow a Kohen to become a king. There had to be a separation of powers, as it were. You're the spiritual leader, the Kohen, you served in the temple. You don't need political power. And ideally, the king should be a descendant of King David, although there was an allowance for other kinds of kings. But ideally, it should be someone from the house of David. So they did have kings then, and they would read the Torah. The Talmud tells the story of a king, Agrippas, who was from the Herodian dynasty, that he would read the Torah on Hakhel. So if you don't have a king, what do? You know, there are certain commandments in the Torah that if you don't have, let's say it's Sukkot, you don't have an etrog, but you have a lemon, it's useless to use a lemon. The Torah doesn't tell us to use a lemon. You can't do it, you can't do it. God will understand that you don't have the ability to do it. But if you don't have a king, what do? So many authorities say that if you didn't have a king, you could use any high-level Jewish leader, like the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, like the great rabbi, or someone who's respected, is looked up to as a leader. That would be sufficient. That person could also read the Torah the year of Hakhel. Who was obligated to be there? Everyone. Men, women, and children. There were exceptions. People who couldn't walk were exempted from it. People who were ritually unclean, who couldn't enter the temple, were exempted. But by and large, every category of Jew was required to participate. The Talmud, the Torah talks about the convert, and there's a discussion about what the Torah means by convert. In those days, there were two kinds of converts in Israel. There's what we call ger tzedek, a righteous convert, which means someone who literally abandons their religion of the past, their idolatrous religion, and embraces Judaism in totality, accepts to fulfill all the commandments. That's what real conversion is. But there's another kind of convert called ger toshav, a settler in Israel, a foreign settler. It refers to someone who is not Jewish and remains non-Jewish, but agrees to live in Israel in accordance with the 7 Noahide commandments, rejecting idolatry and observing all the other 6 Noahide commandments, not to steal, not to kill, and so on. That person was a protected member of the population. The Jews were required to protect that person and to show them respect because they are good citizens. According to one opinion, they should also participate in this Hakhel, which is a very interesting opinion. When did this happen? From the Torah, it seems it happens during the holiday of Sukkot. Which day? So everyone agrees it happened on the second day. Why not the first day? So some argue that they had to build a platform, and you can't build platforms on a holiday, so it would be postponed for the next day. Some say it can be inferred from a biblical verse that it had to be in the middle of the holiday, not the first day. What did the king do? He would read parts of the Torah. He would start with the beginning of Deuteronomy, and he would read all the way through the Shema. What does the Shema emphasize? Acceptance as God, as our king, as our leader. Accepting the sovereignty of God. And then he would skip and read the section, the second part of the Shema, V'haya im Shemoah, which talks about our dedication and acceptance of God's commandments. And then he would read a section about tithing, because this was a time of the year, Sukkot is when you would gather in all your produce from the outside, so that at that time you would have to be careful to tithe your produce. What does tithing involve? You give some of your produce to a priest, to a Kohen. Some of your produce you'd give to a Levi. Some of your produce you would give to the poor. So you'd have to take care of that. So he would read that section as well. And there was a whole ceremony there. Someone would, the Kohanim, I was about to make a joke, but I decided against it. The Kohanim, the priests, would blow golden trumpets. They would station themselves throughout the city and blow these trumpets to invite everyone to come to the temple. It seems that there were Jews who were not so inspired to come to the temple. They were, I live in Jerusalem. People who live in New York, how often do they visit the Statue of Liberty? How often do they visit all the sites? Or how often do Buffalonians visit the Niagara Falls? We have it all the time. Why do I have to go visit every other day? So the same thing happened spiritually in Jerusalem. There were a lot of people in Jerusalem who said, look, I live near the temple. It's a 10-minute walk from me. Why should I go now? So they would have these Kohanim, these priests, stationed all over with golden trumpets. And if you saw a Kohen without a golden trumpet, the Talmud says, it would look like he wasn't really a Kohen. A Kohen's job is to blow the trumpets. And the truth is, every Jew is a Kohen in a certain sense. And we also have to blow the trumpets. What is the idea of a trumpet? It's to awaken people, like the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. It's to awaken people and to get them to move. And the way there was a whole ceremony. They had an attendant. He would carry the Torah, and he would give it to the head of the congregation. That's another position. And the head of the congregation would give it to the deputy high priest, Kohen Gadol, the assistant, and he would give it to the high priest. And the high priest would give it to the king. So there was a whole hierarchy just to give the king more honor, and it's also to honor the Torah, that the Torah is going from one level to another level to a higher level. Now, its connection to the sabbatical year, I already explained some of it, but the Rebbe explains that the sabbatical year has 3 lessons. One lesson of the sabbatical year is that we're not allowed to work on the land. We are not free. We are subjects of God. And we can't just do whatever we want. And I know people say we're living in a free country, we can do whatever we want. Well, that's a myth. We're not living in a free country, and no one has ever lived in a free country. There are laws and rules that you have to follow, and you can't just do whatever you want. If you would have people doing whatever they want, you have anarchy, and you would become a slave to some more powerful anarchist. So you'd be less free than if you live in a country where you follow the rules. So we're not free to do whatever we want. And God tells us, you're not free to do whatever you want. I'm telling you, a year comes and you have to desist from work. So it tells us that we are not in possession of ourselves. We are God's instruments. And that is illustrated by the Shema. The section of the Shema that we read and we declare, God is our God. God is one. That means He's exclusive. We have no other authority over us. And we have to submit ourselves to His authority. That was the first lesson of the sabbatical year, and that's why they read the Shema. The second lesson is that the land belongs to God. The land is not just whoever wants to use the land could use the land. It belongs to God. And during this year, you have no right to work on that land, not just because you belong to God, the land belongs to God. And that's illustrated in the second reading where we talk about the land, where in the second section of the Shema it talks about how God gave us the land and it's His land. And then the third aspect of the sabbatical year, that the produce is free for all. Anyone could take that produce. It's not yours. That means all your resources, all your belongings are not yours. They belong to God. And when God tells us to let others take our resources, we have no problem with that because they weren't ours in the first place. They were given to us, leased to us for 6 years. The 7th year, the lease was withdrawn. And they're free for everyone. You can't even act as if these are really my fruits, but I'm letting you use it. No, they're not your fruits. They don't belong to you anymore. In truth, I didn't mention this before, the sabbatical year also applies to us here in Buffalo and any other place in the world. Rabbinically, it's based on a biblical commandment that you're not allowed to collect debts after the sabbatical year. If someone owes you $1 million and the sabbatical year passes, that's it. The debt is canceled. So the Torah realizes that some people might hesitate to lend money because people will just wait for the sabbatical year and that's it. So the Torah says, if you shall say that you're not going to lend money to anyone, the needy person comes to you and wants to borrow money, and you'll say, I'm not going to do it. No, you're not allowed to think that way. But people are people, humans are humans. So Hillel, the famous sage, enacted what is called Prus Bowl. The Super Bowl and this Prus Bowl. Prus Bowl is an enactment to allow you to collect the debts even after the sabbatical year. Now, how could Hillel go against the Torah? And this is often used by certain groups in the Jewish community to show rabbis have the power to change the laws of the Torah. That's absolutely ridiculous, and it shows their ignorance. Hillel did not change any law of the Torah. Number one, that law only applies to us rabbinically today. As I said before, the laws of the sabbatical year are today only rabbinically in force. Number two, the way the Prus Bowl works is that you hand over your debts to the courts before the sabbatical year ends. That means you're not collecting your debt, it's already in the hands of the court, and the court could collect debts. It's not their debt. So there's a legal device there that allows you to do it only because you had actually transferred the debt. It's no longer you collecting. You're out of the picture. At any rate, but if you didn't do that, if we didn't make the Prus Bowl, it's a very simple thing. At the end of the year, you just say to 3 rabbis, I'm giving over, or you can do it in writing as well, I'm handing over to you all the debts that I may be allowed to collect them. At any rate, yes?
If the debtor still chooses,
if he wants to pay
you back.
Oh yeah, he's allowed. Oh yeah, sure. You have to tell him you don't have to pay, but if he says, no, I want to pay, then he's allowed to do it, yeah.
Could you explain again, you said Hillel didn't modify Chas v'Sholom anything in Torah, but the principle works again.
Right. First of all, it only works for a rabbinical law.
Yeah.
And number two, it's based on a mechanism that the debts are no longer your debts. They were handed over, and it's as if they were already collected. Once the courts have it, it means that the debt is, for all intents and purposes, collected. You're just picking it up. It's already in your possession. That's the theory behind it.
Second only for Bisman Hazeh versus the Rabbonon.
Yeah.
Once it becomes
right
again, there's no.
Right. Once it's biblical, then Prus Bowl wouldn't work. So there were 3 sections of the Torah they would read because there were three messages. Number one, you don't own yourself, you don't own the land, and you don't own your possessions. And that's a sobering thought. Someone could come to you and say, those are not yours, those are God's, so why can't I have it? That's why the Torah says, don't steal. The Torah knew that people will sometimes think that way. That, why shouldn't I take it? Why should you have it? Why can't I have it? As I mentioned before, the Rebbe emphasized that, number one, when we talk about Hakhel, even though it happened during one day of the holiday, it took how many hours? Let's say 5 hours. I don't know how long it took. It's a 5-hour ceremony once a year. So the Rebbe says, no. The entire year is permeated with that spirit of Hakhel, of gathering. The entire year, people should devote to getting together, invite people to your home, and discuss matters of Judaism. Whatever you normally wouldn't do in the past in terms of gathering, focus on gathering during this entire year, but gathering not just to chat, gathering for a purpose of inspiring yourselves and others to become closer to God and closer to the observance of the commandments. Now, we don't have a king, but we do have a king, and the king is us. Every one of us is a king in several ways. Number one, I don't know a person, especially a Jewish person, who doesn't have control over someone else, who doesn't influence others, who doesn't have some type of influence, of some type of power. So in that sense, a parent is a king of his children. Whatever position you're in, you have influence over others. Sometimes they have influence over you, so they're the king. So whoever is the king, and everyone in some sense is a king, should exercise that power to bring people together. Number two, every one of us has different faculties. We have a mind, we have a heart, we have other faculties. We all have to use that power of leadership within ourselves to inspire all of our faculties. There's a famous interpretation of the Hebrew word for king, which is Melech. The word Melech, which means literally king, has three letters in it. The Mem, the first letter, stands for Moach, brain. The second letter, Lamed, stands for Lev, heart. And the third letter, a Chaf, stands for Kaved, the liver. What does that mean? Liver. Kaved is liver in Hebrew. You're only a king if those three are in that order. That your mind controls your emotions, which is symbolized by the heart, and they control the physical aspects of your body. If a person lets his or her emotions control, your emotions tell you what you want, and then your mind starts to think of how to get what you want. So then the word changes. It's no longer Melech, it's Lemech. You know what a Lemech is? No one knows what okay. Lemech is, we just read about him yesterday in the Torah. Lemech was a descendant of Cain, and he was a pitiful character. If we go into the whole medrash that Rashi quotes, his wives were angry at him. Why were they angry at him? Because he was hunting and he was blind. So he took his son along with him, and his son saw some rustling branches, and it was Cain, their ancestor. And they thought it was a deer. What was that story with the vice president? They thought, what? Cheney, yeah. They thought it was a deer, so what's his name? Lemech tells his son, take the arrow and shoot. And he kills Cain. And when he discovered that he killed Cain, he had his son's head over here, and he just got so upset, he went like this, boom, and he killed his son. So he was a hapless, helpless shlemazel. And you know the difference between a shlemiel and a shlemazel and a nudnik. A shlemiel pours the soup, the hot soup, on the shlemazel, and the nudnik asks, what kind of soup was it? Chicken soup or tomato soup? So Lemech was a shlemazel and a nudnik and a shlemiel. He was all three.
Would the term for Lemech be in English a simpleton? Not really.
It's more than a simpleton, a hapless person, someone who has, a big shlemazel. He has no luck. He does everything wrong. Whatever he tries, it fails. If you're a person who your emotions control you, you end up becoming a lemech. I think that's the source why lemech is used in Yiddish as an unfortunate person, because the biblical character, he was a pitiful character. But what happens if you let your hormones, your body, your physical properties control your emotions, which is what happens with the youth, and that controls your mind? Then it reads, kalem, destroy them. You destroy yourself. It's totally destructive. So you're either a melech, a lemech, or kalim could be klum. You're a nobody. You're worthless because you have nothing virtuous that controls you. It's just your physical properties control everything you do. So we have to use our melech. We have to be a king. We have to let our mind control our emotions and our bodies. That whatever we do, our mind controls it, but it's not enough. We have to have the mind coordinating everything. One of the problems that humanity suffers from is that we have everything that we need, but they're not coordinated. We have a mind, most of us have a mind, we have a heart, but we can't coordinate. The mind goes in one direction, the heart goes in a second direction, and the body goes in a third direction. Your faculties are all scattered, fragmented. So the year of Hakhel, we focus on trying to get all of our faculties on the same page. There was once a Hasidic rabbi who had a son-in-law whose custom was to pray on Shabbat very long. He would meditate on every of his prayers, so if normally the congregation took 2 hours to do the prayers, he took 6 hours. And the father-in-law was a little upset because he wanted his son-in-law to be at the Shabbat table to eat the meals with the family. So he made him promise that the next week he would pray with the congregation. Next week comes, and he takes the same 6 hours. So he said to it, later on he confronted him and said, you promised me you would pray with the congregation, and here you did it in 6 hours instead of the 2 hours of the congregation. He said, no, I did exactly that. I prayed with the congregation. What do you mean? He says, every one of us is a congregation. We have many different faculties in us. And I had to work for hours to get them all together in one place. It took me many hours. So uniting, Hakhel could also be a personal thing, bringing all of our faculties together. Sometimes we know what's right in our mind, but we just can't get ourselves inspired to do it. Sometimes we even have good feelings about something, but it doesn't translate into action. One of the ways to deal with that, there's a Talmudic expression, that melody, music, awakens your concentration. Hasidim, when they would pray, they would always sing many of their prayers. Why? Because it awakens concentration. It makes you have better, deeper feelings. The previous Rabbi once explained that the word for concentration, kavanah, could also mean windows. That when you sing, or music in general, opens up windows. Why do you need windows? Because your mind and your heart and your body have barriers between them. How many people know what's right and they don't do what's right? They don't develop the right feelings, and if they have the right feelings, they don't translate it into action because there's a barrier between the mind, the heart, and the body. So you have to open up a window to get the mind to go through the window into the heart, and from the heart into the rest of the person. So the way to do that is through music. So the year of Hakhel is a year that we should maybe do more Jewish music. That's my own suggestion. I'm sure Max will agree. And Rabbi, of course.
I'm ready.
Okay, any questions? Yes?
So Hakhel is a day, but also a year.
Right. It happened in one day, in a few hours in a day, but it defines the whole year. It's a different year. It's a year that takes the inspiration of the sabbatical year and extends it into the rest of the year, into the next 6 years, the next 7 years actually, at least another 6 until the next sabbatical year. See, Judaism, yes?
Do people out of Israel obey the sabbatical year as far as agriculture goes?
Right. When we go to the supermarket and we want to buy a produce of Israel, you have to check on the label if it's produce of the sabbatical year.
Any product.
What?
Any product. Wine, any product.
Right. I use produce, you're right, wine as well. And you have to check to make sure if it is produce of the sabbatical year that it was done consistent with how Jewish law says you deal with it. So that's being kosher in Israel is different than being kosher in America. In America, you can go to a fruit store and buy any fruit or vegetable and not worry about it. It's automatically kosher. Of course, vegetables have to be checked for bugs, but you can buy the vegetable and get rid of the bugs if you want. But in Israel, a fruit store has to be under rabbinic supervision because they have to tithe all their produce. Besides the sabbatical year, is the tithing that requires the owner of the store to tithe his produce. Otherwise, if you buy it, then you have to tithe, and it's a little complicated for someone who's not used to it. Any other questions? Yes?
Who do they give the tithe vegetables to?
We don't give it to anyone because the Kohen is not allowed to eat the tithes because it's it's burnt. It's burnt.
Oh, that's a waste.
If you're looking for waste, you just have to go to any restaurant
I know.
or any caterer. I was once at a bar mitzvah. In a temple, and the tables, each table had hundreds of dollars worth of expensive fish and whatever else, and no one touched it. Everyone was on a diet there, apparently, and I just saw them coming, cleaning up and dumping everything, thousands of dollars of food, of gourmet food, into the garbage. So this is waste. It's very minimal for a holy purpose.
Right.
When we separate challah, which we do even outside of Israel, when we make a batter of dough for bread, we take a piece and we burn it.
Right.
So that's also, you could say, a waste, but it's a small, negligible amount.
And which year is sabbatical?
We just passed the sabbatical year.
21st?
Well, it's not exactly the same as the Jewish year was 5,782. That was the sabbatical year. Now we're 5,783. So now we're the Hakhel post-sabbatical year.
We'll have the sabbatical year in 6 years.
I missed before, one of the questions were which day on Sukkot was the official Hakhel?
The second day, because according to Rashi, they had to build a platform. You can't build that. But
So obviously there was no Yom Tov Sheni in those days.
right, the second day was a Chol
Thursday,
Hamoed.
Chol Hamoed.
Right.